Faith Dunbar never imagined she'd offer to marry a man everyone believed was a demon, but desperation has a way of making the impossible seem reasonable. The October wind cut through Millfield like a blade, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the distant promise of snow. Faith pulled her wool shawl tighter as she guided her rickety wagon down Main Street, the wheels creaking a mournful song that matched her mood. 3 months had passed since the mine collapse that took her husband. Daniel and the banker's final notice sat folded in her coat pocket like a death sentence. 30 days to pay what she owed, or lose everything Daniel had worked himself to death trying to build. She hadn't meant to stop at the town square. Her destination was the general store, where she planned to trade her grandmother's china for enough supplies to last through winter. But the crowd gathered around something in the center of the square drew her attention like moths to flame. Angry voices rose above the general murmur, punctuated by the occasional thud of something hitting metal. Faith climbed down from her wagon, her boots squelching in the mud as she pushed through the crowd of settlers, miners, and cowboys. What she saw made her stomach lurch. In the center of the square sat an iron cage, barely large enough for a man to stand upright, its bars thick as her wrist and black with rust. Inside, a figure sat motionless against the back wall, knees drawn up, head bowed so low that his long, black hair fell like a curtain across his face. 10 cents to spit on the savage, called out Tom Bradley, the blacksmith, his voice booming over the crowd. Quarter to throw a rock, $1 to poke him with this here stick. He held up a long iron rod, its tip sharpened to a cruel point. The crowd laughed, and several men reached for their coin purses. Faith had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in the territory had. The Modoc warrior they called Raven, captured after a raid that left 3 homesteads burned and 7 settlers dead. They said he moved like smoke through the darkness, that he could kill a man without making a sound, that his eyes held the fires of hell itself. The army had wanted to hang him immediately, but territorial law demanded a trial, so they'd caged him like a wild animal and put him on display while they waited for the circuit judge to arrive. A young boy, no more than 12, picked up a stone and hurled it at the cage. It struck the bars with a sharp clang, but the man inside didn't flinch, didn't move, didn't even lift his head. The crowd cheered as if they'd witnessed something magnificent rather than the torment of a caged human being. "What's he done?" Faith asked quietly, though she already knew the answer. Mrs. Patterson, the pastor's wife, turned to her with gleaming eyes that held too much satisfaction. "Burned out the Morrison place. Killed Jim Morrison and his boy. Left Mary Morrison for dead, though she lived long enough to identify him before the fever took her." Mrs. Patterson's voice dropped to a whisper. "They say he scalped them while they were still breathing. They say he drinks blood and eats the hearts of children." Faith looked back at the figure in the cage. If he was a monster, he was a remarkably still one. No pacing, no snarling, no rattling of the bars, just absolute unnerving silence. "Sheriff." Hawkins stood nearby, leaning against a hitching post and whittling a piece of pine with practiced indifference. He was a large man with a grey beard and eyes that had seen too much frontier justice to be surprised by anything. Faith approached him carefully. "Sheriff," she said, keeping her voice low, "how long has he been in there?" 6 days, Hawkins replied without looking up from his whittling. "Judge won't be here for another 2 weeks, maybe 3 if the weather turns bad. Folks are getting restless, wanting to speed things up if you catch my meaning." Faith caught his meaning perfectly. Lynch law was common enough in the territories, especially when it came to Indian raids. The cage wasn't just punishment, it was protection. Protection for Raven from a mob that grew more bloodthirsty by the day. "Is he dangerous?" she asked. Studying the motionless figure, Sheriff Hawkins finally looked up, his weathered face creasing into something that might have been amusement. "To who?" Man hasn't moved since we put him in there. Won't eat, won't drink, won't speak. Doc Henley thinks he's waiting to die. And if he does die, then we bury him and move on. Saves the territory the cost of a trial and a hanging. Hawkins went back to his whittling wood shavings, falling like snow at his feet. Faith watched another stone bounce off the cage bars. This time, something made her step closer. Close enough to see that the man's buckskin shirt was torn and stained, with what looked like old blood. Close enough to notice that his wrists bore the raw marks of iron shackles. Close enough to catch a glimpse of his face when the wind stirred his hair. He was younger than she'd expected. Perhaps 30, with high cheekbones and copper skin that spoke of pure Modoc blood, but it was his eyes that stopped her breath. When he lifted his head just slightly, just enough for her to see them, they weren't the fires of hell that the stories promised. They were empty, completely, utterly empty, like looking into a deep well at midnight. The crowd pressed closer, emboldened by whiskey and righteousness. Someone had brought a bucket of kitchen slops, and they were debating whether to dump it through the bars. Faith found herself standing directly in front of the cage now, close enough that she could have reached through and touched him. "You got business with the prisoner, ma'am." The voice belonged to Deputy Walsh, a weasel-faced man who took far too much pleasure in his authority. He'd appeared beside her with the silent menace of a snake, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Just curious," Faith replied. "Not moving away from the cage. Heard the stories. Wanted to see for myself." "Well, you've seen. Now move along. This ain't no place for a decent woman." Walsh's tone carried an implicit threat, but Faith had dealt with worse than Deputy Walsh. In her 32 years of life, instead of moving away, she stepped even closer to the cage. The man inside, Raven, was watching her now through the curtain of his hair. Not with interest, not with hope, but with the detached curiosity of someone observing an unusual insect. "Does he have a name?" Faith asked. "His real name, I mean. Not what you call him. Names are for people," Walsh sneered. "That thing ain't people. That's a murdering savage that needs putting down like a rabid dog." For the first time since she'd arrived at the square, Raven moved. His head came up fully, and his eyes fixed on Deputy Walsh with an intensity that made the smaller man take an involuntary step backward. There was no fire in that gaze, no rage, just a cold assessment that seemed to catalogue every weakness, every vulnerability, every way a man could die. Walsh's hand tightened on his pistol, but he didn't draw. Even he wasn't fool enough to shoot an unarmed man in a cage in front of half the town. "Easy there, killer," Walsh muttered, but his voice had lost its swagger. "Save that look for the hangman." Raven's gaze shifted back to Faith, and she felt the full weight of his attention like a physical thing. He was studying her the same way he'd studied Walsh, but without the predatory calculation. More like he was trying to solve a puzzle that made no sense to him. The crowd was growing restless. Someone suggested bringing a torch to see how the savage liked fire. Others were debating the merits of various forms of torment. Faith realized with growing horror that this wasn't just entertainment, it was a prelude. These people were working themselves up to something that would end with Raven's death, trial or no trial. She thought of Daniel then, and the promise she'd made at his graveside. To be strong, to survive, to not let the frontier break her the way it had broken so many others. But strength, she was learning, sometimes looked nothing like what people expected. Faith reached into her coat and pulled out the banker's notice, unfolding it with hands that barely trembled. 30 days to pay Daniel's debts or lose the farm. 30 days to find money she didn't have, to pay for mistakes that weren't hers, to salvage a life that felt increasingly hollow without the man who'd shared it. But there were other laws in the territories, older laws that superseded banks and mortgages and the tidy paperwork of civilization, laws that recognized marriage as a bond that transferred debts and obligations along with names and property. "Sheriff Hawkins," Faith called out, her voice carrying clearly across the square. The crowd began to quiet. sensing something significant in her tone. "Yes, ma'am. What would it take to secure this man's release?" The question fell into the sudden silence like a stone into still water. Sheriff Hawkins stopped whittling. Deputy Walsh turned to stare at her with his mouth slightly open. Even the crowd seemed frozen, uncertain they'd heard correctly. "Ma'am," Hawkins said carefully. "You heard me, Sheriff. What would it take to buy his freedom?" Faith's voice was steady now, powered by a decision that felt both insane and inevitable. "Mrs. Dunbar," Sheriff Hawkins said slowly, "that man is accused of murder. He's not for sale like a horse or a bushel of wheat. Everything's for sale on the frontier," Faith replied. "The question is price." She looked directly at Raven, who was watching this exchange with the first hint of expression she'd seen from him. Surprise, perhaps, or confusion. The crowd began to murmur, then to speak more loudly. "She's lost her mind," someone said. "Grief's made her crazy," said another, but Faith ignored them all, keeping her attention on the sheriff. "Territorial law," she continued, "allows for marriage bonds to transfer legal obligations. If I were to marry this man, his debts would become mine, but his fate would be tied to mine as well. A married woman can't be hanged for her husband's crimes, and a husband under his wife's bond can't be tried without her consent." Sheriff Hawkins was no longer whittling. He was staring at Faith like she'd announced her intention to sprout wings and fly to the moon. "Mrs. Dunbar, you can't be serious." "I'm perfectly serious, Sheriff. Will you perform the ceremony, or do I need to find someone who will?" Faith's heart was pounding so hard she was certain everyone could hear it, but her voice remained level. "You want to marry him?" Deputy Walsh's voice cracked on the last word. "You want to marry that murdering savage?" "I want to marry a man who deserves better than to be caged like an animal while children throw stones at him," Faith replied. "Whether he's guilty or innocent, he's still a human being." The crowd exploded into chaos. Some shouted that she was insane, others that she was a traitor to her own kind. A few women began weeping as if witnessing the end of civilization itself. But through it all, Faith kept her eyes on Raven. He was staring at her with something that might have been wonder. Not gratitude, not relief, but pure bewilderment at finding himself the center of an act of inexplicable kindness. When their eyes met, she saw something flicker in those dark depths. Not hope exactly, but perhaps the memory of what hope had once felt like. Sheriff Hawkins held up his hand for quiet, and gradually the crowd settled into an expectant hush. "Mrs. Dunbar," he said carefully, "even if such a thing were legal, which I'm not saying it is, why would you do such a thing? What could you possibly gain?" Faith looked around the square, at the faces filled with bloodlust and righteous anger, at the cage that held a man everyone had decided was less than human. She thought of Daniel's debts, of the farm she was about to lose, of the long winter ahead, with nothing but loneliness and poverty for company. But mostly, she thought of the emptiness in Raven's eyes and how it matched the emptiness in her own heart since Daniel's death. Two broken souls, perhaps, but maybe brokenness shared was better than brokenness endured alone. "I gain a husband," she said simply, "and he gains a chance at life. In the territories, Sheriff, that's about as fair a trade as anyone can hope." For the silence that followed Faith's declaration stretched like a taut rope, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Sheriff Hawkins rubbed his beard thoughtfully, his eyes moving between Faith and the caged man, as if calculating odds in a poker game where the stakes were higher than anyone had anticipated. "Mrs. Dunbar," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd seen the frontier chew up and spit out countless dreamers and idealists, "I'm going to ask you one more time to think about what you're saying. That man in there is accused of killing 3 people, including a 12-year-old boy. You understand that?" Faith's hands trembled slightly as she folded the banker's notice and returned it to her coat pocket, but her voice remained steady. "I understand perfectly, Sheriff. I also understand that accusations aren't convictions, and caging a man like an animal isn't justice." Deputy Walsh spat into the mud, his face twisted with disgust. "Justice? Lady, you want to see justice? Let's string him up right now and save everyone the trouble. That's frontier justice. That's mob rule," Faith shot back, her Irish temper flaring for the first time. "And if that's what we've become, then we're no better than the savages we claim to be fighting." The crowd erupted again, but this time with genuine anger rather than mere bloodlust. Several men stepped forward, their faces dark with indignation. Tom Bradley, the blacksmith, pointed a thick finger at Faith like he was identifying a criminal. "You calling us savages, woman? We're civilized folks trying to protect our families from murdering heathens. What's savage about that?" His voice boomed across the square, and murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Faith looked around at the faces surrounding her. Men and women she'd known for 3 years, people who'd attended Daniel's funeral and offered their condolences, but now they looked at her like she'd betrayed everything they stood for. Perhaps she had. "I'm calling caged entertainment savage," she replied, gesturing toward the iron prison where Raven sat motionless. "I'm calling 10 cents to spit on a helpless man savage. I'm calling the torment of someone who can't defend himself savage. Helpless." Mrs. Patterson's voice rose to near hysteria. "That monster killed the Morrison family, burned their home while they slept. How is that helpless?" "He's helpless now," Faith said quietly. "Whatever he may have done, he's helpless now. And what we do to helpless people says more about us than it does about them." Sheriff Hawkins raised his hand again, and the crowd reluctantly quieted. He walked closer to the cage, studying its occupant with the practiced eye of a lawman who dealt with his share of dangerous men. Raven hadn't moved during the entire exchange, but his dark eyes tracked every speaker, every gesture, cataloging information with the intensity of a man whose life might depend on understanding the currents of emotions swirling around him. "Even if I wanted to consider such a fool proposal," Hawkins said slowly, "there are procedures, legal requirements. Can't just marry off a prisoner on a whim, especially not to—" He caught himself before finishing the sentence, but Faith understood perfectly. "Especially not to a decent white woman," she finished for him. "Is that what you were going to say, Sheriff?" Hawkins had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Mrs. Dunbar, you're asking me to perform a marriage between a Christian woman and a heathen warrior accused of murder. Even if the law allowed it, which I'm not certain it does, what kind of precedent would that set?" "The precedent that the law applies equally to everyone," Faith replied. "That a man is innocent until proven guilty, regardless of the color of his skin. That marriage is a sacred bond that transcends the temporary passions of a mob." Dr. Marcus Henley, the town's physician and one of its most educated residents, pushed through the crowd carrying his black medical bag. He was a thin, scholarly man who'd come west to escape consumption and stayed to practice medicine on the frontier. Unlike most of the others, his face showed curiosity rather than anger. "Sheriff," he said, slightly out of breath from his hurried walk, "I've been researching the territorial statutes. Mrs. Dunbar is correct about the marriage bond law. It's an old English common law principle that was incorporated into territorial legislation to protect women from their husbands' debts and crimes." "What exactly does that mean, Doc?" Hawkins asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer wouldn't please him. Dr. Henley adjusted his spectacles and spoke with the precision of a man who'd spent his life dealing in facts rather than emotions. "It means that if Mrs. Dunbar were to legally marry the prisoner, several things would happen automatically. First, his debts and legal obligations would transfer to her, but so would her protection under territorial law. Second, as a married woman, she cannot be compelled to testify against her husband, nor can he be tried for capital crimes without her explicit consent. The crowd's murmur shifted from anger to confusion. This was getting complicated in ways they hadn't anticipated. But Doc, Deputy Walsh interjected, surely that law wasn't meant to apply to Indian prisoners. It was meant for white folks. The law makes no distinction based on race. Dr. Henley replied calmly. It applies to any legal marriage performed within territorial boundaries. The question isn't whether the prisoner is Indian. The question is whether he's capable of legal consent. All eyes turned to the cage, where Raven sat in his characteristic silence. For the first time since Faith had arrived, she addressed him directly. "Can you speak English?" she asked, her voice gentle but clear. Raven's head turned slightly, his dark eyes fixing on her face. When he spoke, his voice was rough from disuse, but perfectly understandable, carrying only the slightest trace of an accent. "I speak English," he said simply. The crowd gasped as if they'd witnessed a miracle. Somehow his silence had made them forget that he was a person capable of communication. "Do you understand what's being discussed here?" Faith continued, ignoring the shocked murmurs around her. Raven studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You offer marriage to save my life. Why?" The question hung in the air, like smoke from a distant fire. Faith found herself struggling to answer, not because she didn't know why, but because the truth was too complex for simple explanation. "Because everyone deserves a chance to prove their innocence," she said finally, "and because I believe. There's more to your story than what people are saying. You know nothing about me," Raven replied, his voice flat and emotionless. "You know nothing about what I have done, what I am capable of doing. Why would you tie your fate to mine?" Faith looked around the square, at the faces filled with hatred and fear, at the cage that reduced a human being to a spectacle. When she spoke, her voice carried across the square with surprising strength. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything. I know what it's like to be alone in a world that doesn't care whether you live or die. And I know that sometimes the only way to survive is to help someone else survive." Raven stared at her for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost wondering. "You would bind yourself to a man everyone calls a monster?" "I would bind myself to a man everyone has decided is a monster, without trial or evidence beyond their own fear," Faith corrected. "There's a difference." Sheriff Hawkins stepped forward, his face grim. "Mrs. Dunbar, I'm going to give you one last chance to reconsider this madness. Even if Dr. Henley is right about the law, even if I performed such a ceremony, you'd be marrying a man who might well be guilty of the crimes he's accused of. Are you prepared to live with that possibility?" Faith thought of Daniel's funeral, of standing alone beside his grave while the preacher spoke about God's plan, and the mourners offered empty condolences. She thought of the banker's notice in her pocket, of the farm that would soon belong to someone else, of the long winter ahead with nothing but memories for company. "Sheriff," she said quietly, "I've been living with possibilities I never imagined for 3 months now. The possibility that Daniel died for nothing. The possibility that I'll lose everything he worked for. The possibility that I'll spend the rest of my life alone in a world that has no place for women without men to protect them." She turned to look directly at Raven, who was watching her with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as if he could see straight through to her soul. "At least this way, I'll be taking a chance on something instead of just waiting for life to happen to me. And maybe, just maybe, I'll be saving a life instead of watching another one be thrown away." The crowd had grown quieter, sensing that something significant was happening beyond their understanding. Even the children had stopped throwing stones, caught up in the adult drama unfolding before them. Dr. Henley cleared his throat diplomatically. "If I may suggest, Sheriff, there's precedent for such marriages in territorial law. The Miller case in Colorado, the Thompson situation in Wyoming, both involved unusual circumstances, but both were upheld by territorial courts." "This is different," Deputy Walsh protested. "Those were white folks marrying white folks. This is a legal marriage between two consenting adults," Dr. Henley interrupted firmly. "The territorial constitution explicitly prohibits discrimination based on race in matters of legal contract, which marriage certainly is." Sheriff Hawkins looked like a man caught between equally unpalatable choices. If he refused to perform the ceremony, he'd be violating territorial law and his oath of office. If he agreed, he'd be sanctioning something that violated every social convention of frontier society. "Raven," Faith said suddenly, using his English name for the first time. "Do you consent to this marriage?" The question seemed to surprise him. Perhaps no one had asked for his consent to anything in quite some time. He studied her face as if searching for deception or hidden motives. "You know I am Modoc," he said. "Finally, you know my people and yours have killed each other for generations. You know that marrying me will make you an outcast among your own kind." "I know all of that," Faith replied. "Do you consent?" Another long pause. When Raven spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been respect. "I consent," he said simply. Sheriff Hawkins muttered something under his breath that sounded like a prayer or a curse. "Doc, you're absolutely certain about the law?" "Absolutely certain, Sheriff. The marriage bond statute is quite clear." "And the key?" Faith asked, looking at the heavy iron lock that secured the cage door. "Once we're married, territorial law requires his immediate release into my custody, correct?" Dr. Henley nodded. "That's correct. A married woman has legal authority over her husband's person in matters of bail and custody, particularly when charges haven't yet been formally filed." The crowd was growing restless again, sensing that their entertainment was about to be taken away. Several men began shouting objections, but Sheriff Hawkins silenced them with a sharp gesture. "If we're going to do this fool thing," he said grimly, "we're going to do it proper and legal. Doc, you'll serve as witness. Deputy Walsh, you'll record the ceremony in the official log. Mrs. Dunbar, you'll be responsible for the prisoner's conduct and whereabouts until trial." "Understood," Faith said, her heart hammering so hard she felt dizzy. "When?" "Right now," Hawkins replied. "Before I come to my senses and remember why this is the worst idea I've ever heard." He pulled out a small black book from his coat pocket, a combination of legal codes and religious passages that allowed him to perform marriages in his capacity as a territorial officer. As he opened it, searching for the appropriate ceremony, Faith found herself looking once more at the man she was about to marry. Raven sat perfectly still in the cage, but his eyes held a depth of emotion she hadn't seen before. Not gratitude exactly, but something more complex, a mixture of surprise, wariness, and perhaps the faintest hint of hope. When their eyes met, he spoke so quietly that only she could hear. "Are you certain, Faith Dunbar? Once spoken, these words cannot be taken back." Faith thought of all the words that couldn't be taken back. Daniel's last words before he left for the mine that morning, the doctor's words about the cave-in, the banker's words about debts and deadlines. Sometimes words had the power to destroy everything you thought you knew about your life. "I'm certain," she said, and meant it. Sheriff Hawkins began to read from the book, his voice carrying across the square with reluctant authority. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Faith Dunbar and the man known as Raven in the bonds of matrimony." As the familiar words washed over her, Faith realized that in all her imaginings of marriage, she'd never pictured herself speaking vows to a man in a cage while an angry crowd watched. But then again, she'd never imagined being a widow at 32, or facing bankruptcy, or standing alone against the judgment of an entire town. The frontier, she was learning, had a way of making the unimaginable seem almost reasonable. Sheriff. Hawkins's voice carried the weight of reluctant authority as he continued reading from the worn legal manual, each word falling into the tense silence like stones into still water. The crowd pressed closer, no longer jeering, but transfixed by the bizarre ceremony unfolding before them. Never in the history of Millfield had anyone witnessed a wedding performed with the groom locked in an iron cage. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Do you, Faith Dunbar, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part? The sheriff's voice cracked slightly on the final words, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was saying. Faith looked through the iron bars at Raven, who sat perfectly still, but watched her with an intensity that made her feel as though he was memorizing every detail of her face. His dark eyes held no expectation, no plea for rescue, just a calm acceptance that his fate now rested entirely in her hands. The weight of that responsibility settled over her like a heavy cloak. "I do," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the square with surprising strength. A collective gasp rose from the crowd, as if they'd held onto some last hope that she would come to her senses at the final moment. Sheriff Hawkins turned to the cage, his expression grim as weathered granite. "Do you, the man called Raven, take Faith Dunbar to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" Raven rose slowly to his feet for the first time since Faith had arrived at the square. Even cramped by the low ceiling of the cage, he was taller than she'd expected, with the lean, powerful build of a man accustomed to living off the land. His movements held a fluid grace that spoke of years spent moving silently through forest and mountain. But there was something broken in the way he held himself, as if the cage had bent something inside him that might never straighten again. "I do," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite its quietness. The words seemed to surprise him as much as they surprised the crowd, as if he hadn't quite believed this moment would actually arrive. Dr. Henley stepped forward with a small metal flask of ink and a quill pen, preparing to record the marriage in his physician's ledger since no proper marriage registry was available. "We'll need signatures," he said professionally, though his hands trembled slightly as he opened the ledger to a blank page. "How's he supposed to sign from in there?" Deputy Walsh demanded, his voice thick with disgust at the entire proceeding. "We can't just open the cage before the ceremony's complete. The ceremony is complete when I say it's complete," Sheriff Hawkins replied sharply, "and territorial law is clear about a wife's custody rights over her husband. The moment these vows are spoken, Mrs. Dunbar, Mrs. Raven, has legal authority over her husband's person." The name change hit Faith like a physical blow. Mrs. Raven. In the space of 5 minutes, she'd gone from Faith Dunbar, struggling widow, to Faith Raven, wife of an accused murderer. The transformation felt surreal, as if she was watching someone else's life unfold. Sheriff Hawkins pulled a heavy iron key from his belt, its metal blackened with age and rust. The key to Raven's cage, and now, in a strange way, the key to Faith's future. He hesitated for a moment, looking around at the crowd as if expecting someone to produce a compelling reason to stop this madness. "Sheriff," Tom Bradley called out, his blacksmith's voice booming across the square, "you can't seriously be considering releasing that savage into our community. What about our families? What about our children?" What about the law? Faith shot back before the sheriff could respond. What about the presumption of innocence? What about the idea that we're supposed to be better than the people we're fighting? Mrs. Patterson pushed to the front of the crowd, her face flushed with righteous indignation. Better? You think marrying a heathen murderer makes you better? You think bringing that monster into our midst makes you righteous? Faith turned to face. The crowd fully, feeling a strange calm settle over her, despite the hostility radiating from dozens of faces she'd once considered friendly. I think giving a man a chance to prove his innocence makes me human. I think refusing to participate in mob justice makes me civilized. And I think standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, makes me worthy of the country my husband died trying to build. The mention of Daniel's sacrifice seemed to take some of the wind out of the crowd's sails. Several people looked uncomfortable, remembering the young man who died in the mine collapse while trying to extract enough ore to pay for equipment the community needed. Sheriff Hawkins made his decision with a heavy sigh that spoke of a man who'd learned to live with consequences he couldn't predict. He stepped to the cage door and inserted the key into the heavy lock. The mechanism was stiff with rust and disuse, requiring several attempts before it finally turned with a grinding metallic screech that seemed to echo off every building in the square. The door swung open with a protesting creak of hinges, and for the first time in 6 days, nothing stood between Raven and freedom except his own choice to step through the doorway. He remained motionless for several heartbeats, staring at the open door as if it might be a hallucination brought on by days of captivity. "Come on out," Faith said gently, extending her hand toward him. "It's finished." Raven looked at her, outstretched hand for a long moment, then slowly reached through the bars to touch her fingers with his own. His hand was warm, despite the October chill, with calluses that spoke of hard work and careful craftsmanship. More surprising was the gentleness of his touch, as if he was afraid she might dissolve if he gripped too tightly. He stepped out of the cage with careful, measured movements, his body adjusting to freedom like a man learning to walk again. The crowd instinctively pressed backward, creating a circle of empty space around the newly married couple. Even those who'd been most eager to torment him seemed suddenly aware that they were now dealing with a free man under the protection of territorial law. "Doctor!" Henley approached with his ledger and quill, his medical training allowing him to maintain professional composure even in the most unusual circumstances. "If you could both sign here," he said, indicating the appropriate lines in his careful script. Faith signed first, her signature shakier than usual but clearly legible. Faith Dunbar Raven. The new name looked strange on the page, like words in a foreign language she was still learning to speak. Raven took the quill with surprising delicacy, considering the size of his hands. His signature was a careful combination of English letters and native symbols, creating something that was neither fully one culture nor the other, but uniquely his own. When he finished, he looked up at Faith with an expression she couldn't quite read. "It's done then," Sheriff Hawkins said grimly, closing Dr. Henley's ledger with a sharp snap. "Mrs. Raven, your husband is now in your custody. You're responsible for his actions, his whereabouts, and his appearance at trial when the circuit judge arrives. You understand the gravity of that responsibility?" "I understand," Faith replied, though she was beginning to wonder if anyone could truly understand the gravity of what she'd just committed herself to. Deputy Walsh spat into the mud again, his face twisted with disgust. "This is a travesty of justice. That savage should be dangling from a rope, not walking free because some grief-addled woman lost her mind." Before Faith could respond, Raven spoke for the first time since leaving the cage, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made everyone in the square fall silent. "Deputy Walsh," he said, his English precise despite the slight accent, "you speak of justice, but you wanted to hang me without trial. You wanted to make me entertainment for children throwing stones. Tell me, which one of us behaves like a savage?" The deputy's hand moved instinctively toward his pistol, but Sheriff Hawkins's sharp gesture stopped him. "Easy, Walsh. The man's got a point, and he's got rights now whether we like it or not." Raven turned to address the crowd, his stance relaxed but somehow commanding. "You fear me because you believe I killed innocent people. I understand that fear, but I will not run from trial. I will not hide from justice. I will stay in this community until the judge arrives and the truth is revealed." "And what if the truth is that you're guilty?" Tom Bradley challenged, his massive frame tensed as if ready for a fight. "What if you did burn out the Morrison place?" Raven met the blacksmith's glare without flinching. "Then I will face the consequences of my actions. But until that truth is proven, I ask only for what every man deserves: the chance to defend himself with words rather than die from the stones of those who have already decided his fate." Faith found herself studying her new husband's profile as he spoke, noting the intelligence in his dark eyes and the careful way he chose his words. This was not the mindless savage the stories had painted. This was an educated man who spoke better English than half the people in the crowd. "Where will you live?" Mrs. Patterson demanded shrilly. "Surely you don't expect to be welcomed into decent homes after this abomination of a marriage?" Faith had been dreading this question, but she answered with more confidence than she felt. "We'll live at my farm, Daniel's farm. It's outside town, so we won't trouble anyone who doesn't want to be troubled." "Your farm?" Sheriff Hawkins looked surprised. "Mrs. Dunbar, Mrs. Raven, didn't the bank serve you with foreclosure papers? I thought you had 30 days to settle Daniel's debts." The reminder hit Faith like a physical blow, bringing her crashing back to the practical realities that had driven her to this desperate act in the first place. "That's right," she said quietly. 30 days to find money. I don't have to pay debts I didn't incur, but now those debts are legally transferred to your husband," Dr. Henley observed thoughtfully. "According to territorial law, a wife's property becomes her husband's responsibility upon marriage, but so do her obligations become his." Raven turned to look at Faith with something that might have been amusement flickering in his dark eyes. "So you have married me to save my life, and I have married you to inherit your debts. That seems fair, despite everything." Faith found herself almost smiling at the dry humor in his voice. "I suppose it does, though I should warn you, the debts are considerable. Money can be earned," Raven replied simply. "Life, once lost, cannot be recovered. I believe I've received the better part of this bargain." Sheriff Hawkins looked around at the crowd, which seemed uncertain how to react to this unexpected turn of events. The spectacle they'd come to enjoy had transformed into something more complex and uncomfortable than simple entertainment. "All right, folks," he said loudly. "Show's over. These people have legal business to attend to, and we all have work to do. Move along now." The crowd began to disperse reluctantly, people clustering in small groups to discuss what they'd witnessed and what it might mean for their community. Faith could hear fragments of their conversations as they walked away, words like abomination and disaster mixed with quieter voices expressing confusion and even occasionally a grudging respect for what she'd done. As the square emptied, Faith found herself alone with her new husband, Sheriff Hawkins, Dr. Henley, and Deputy Walsh. The silence that fell over them was awkward and heavy, filled with unspoken questions and unexamined implications. "Mrs. Raven," Dr. Henley said finally, his professional manner reasserting itself, "I should examine your husband. 6 days in that cage, with minimal food and water. There could be health concerns that need addressing." Raven shook his head firmly. "I am well enough. I do not need a white man's medicine." "You need something," Faith said, studying his face more closely in the afternoon light. Now that he was standing in the open, she could see the toll his captivity had taken. His skin had a grayish pallor, beneath its natural copper tone, and his clothes hung loose on a frame that suggested significant weight loss. "What I need," Raven said quietly, "is to understand why you have done this thing. To save a stranger's life at such cost to yourself, that is not something I have seen often from your people." Faith looked around the square, now empty except for their small group and the abandoned cage that stood like an accusation in the center of the space. How could she explain the complex mixture of desperation, principle, and lonely grief that had driven her to this moment? "Maybe," she said finally, "we can discuss that when we get home. But first, I think Dr. Henley is right. You need food and medical attention whether you want them or not." Sheriff Hawkins cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mrs. Raven, I have to ask, do you have any way to guarantee that your husband won't simply disappear into the mountains? Because if he runs, you'll be held responsible under territorial law." Faith looked at Raven, who met her gaze steadily. "Will you run?" she asked directly. "Where would I go?" he replied. "My people are scattered or dead. The soldiers hunt any Modoc they find in the mountains. And now I have made a promise to you and to this community. I do not break my promises, even promises made under duress." Dr. Henley asked gently. Raven considered this question carefully before answering. "Especially promises made under duress. Those are the promises that reveal who a man truly is." Faith felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't even realized she was carrying. Whatever else Raven might be, he was a man who understood the weight of his word. "Then let's go home," she said, turning toward her wagon. "We have a lot to figure out, and winter's coming whether we're ready for it or not." As they walked toward the wagon together, Faith caught sight of their reflection in the window of Morrison's general store, a small woman in a worn dress and a tall, dark-skinned man in buckskins, walking side by side like any married couple heading home after an ordinary day in town. The ordinariness of the image struck her as almost laughable, given the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. But perhaps, she thought, all marriages began with a leap of faith into the unknown. She just hoped they would both survive the landing. The wagon ride to Faith's farm passed in silence, broken only by the creak of wheels and the steady clip-clop of her mare's hooves on the hard-packed dirt road. Raven sat beside her on the narrow bench, his presence both familiar and utterly foreign, like a word she'd heard before but never fully understood. The October afternoon was growing cold, and she could see her breath misting in the air between them. Faith stole glances at her new husband as they traveled, noting details she'd missed in the chaos of the town square. His hands, resting quietly on his knees, bore small scars that spoke of a life lived outdoors, cuts from knives, burns from fires, the calloused palms of someone who worked with his hands. His profile, when he turned to scan the tree line for threats she couldn't see, revealed high cheekbones and a strong jaw that might have been handsome under different circumstances. "You keep looking at me," he said suddenly, his voice startling her from her observations. "Are you having regrets?" Faith felt heat rise to her cheeks at being caught staring. "I'm trying to understand what I've done," she admitted. "An hour ago, I was a widow facing bankruptcy. Now I'm married to a man I know nothing about." "You know I speak English," Raven replied, with what might have been dry humor. "You know I do not break promises. You know I did not run when the cage door opened. That is more than many marriages begin with." The truth of that statement hit her unexpectedly. She'd known Daniel for 6 months before their wedding. But looking back, she wondered how much she'd truly known about the man who'd shared her bed and dreams for 3 years. People she was learning were mysteries that revealed themselves slowly, if at all. "Tell me about the Morrison family," she said, as they crested a small hill that brought her farm into view. "Tell me what really happened that night." Raven was quiet for so long that Faith began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made her understand why silence had been his refuge for 6 days. "Jim Morrison was a good man," he said slowly. "He hired Modoc workers when others would not, paid fair wages, treated us with respect. His wife Mary brought medicine when our children were sick. Their boy Tommy played with our children when the adults were working. Faith pulled the wagon to a stop in front of her farmhouse, but neither of them moved to get down." The story Raven was telling didn't match the version she'd heard in town, and she needed to understand the difference. "Then why do people believe you killed them?" she asked gently. Raven's hands clenched slowly into fists, then relaxed, with visible effort. "Because I was there that night. Because I was found with Jim's saddlebags. Because I was covered in blood and could not explain how it happened. Could not, or would not, could not." His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "There are things that happened that night that I do not remember. Things that make no sense. To me, even now." Faith studied his profile, noting the tension in his jaw and the way his eyes had gone distant and haunted. "Were you drinking? Some of the men in town say Indians can't handle liquor." Raven turned to look at her directly, and she saw a flash of anger in his dark eyes. "I do not drink the white man's poison. My people learned long ago what whiskey does to our minds and spirits. Then what happened to your memory?" "I do not know." The admission seemed to cost him something. "I remember working late, helping Jim repair his barn roof. I remember Mary calling us in for supper. I remember Tommy showing me a bird's nest he'd found. After that—" He stopped, shaking his head in frustration. "After that, I woke up 3 miles away at dawn, covered in blood that was not mine, carrying saddlebags I had no memory of taking. The soldiers found me there, walking in circles like a madman, unable to explain what had happened." Faith felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. "Someone drugged you? Perhaps. Or perhaps I am simply going mad, as my grandfather did in his final years. Perhaps the white man's world has finally broken something in my mind that cannot be repaired." The pain in his voice was so raw that Faith reached out instinctively, covering one of his hands with hers. His skin was warm, despite the cold, and she felt him tense at the unexpected touch, before gradually relaxing. "You're not mad," she said firmly. "Mad men don't speak the way you do. They don't keep promises or honor marriage vows to strangers. Someone did this to you, and we're going to figure out who and why." Raven stared down at their joined hands with an expression she couldn't read. "You believe me, even though the evidence—" "The evidence doesn't make sense," Faith interrupted. "If you'd wanted to rob the Morrisons, why would you carry the stolen goods 3 miles into the open where anyone could find you? If you'd wanted to kill them, why would you do it on a night when half the town knew you were there working? And if you're really the savage monster everyone claims, why haven't you hurt me?" Raven lifted his eyes to meet hers, and she saw something shift in their dark depths. Not hope exactly, but perhaps the possibility of hope. "You think like a detective rather than a settler," he observed. "I think like a woman who's had to survive on her own," Faith replied. "When you're alone in the world, you learn to look past what people tell you to see what's actually there." A gust of wind reminded them both that they were sitting in an open wagon while the afternoon grew colder and darker. Faith gathered the reins and guided the mare toward the small barn behind her farmhouse. "Home," she said, though the word felt strange applied to a place she would now share with a man she'd married to save his life. Such as it is, the Dunbar farm was modest but well-maintained, testament to Daniel's careful husbandry and Faith's determined efforts to keep his work alive. The house was a simple 2-room structure with a stone chimney and glass windows that had cost Daniel 2 months' wages. The barn was larger than the house, built to shelter animals and equipment through the harsh mountain winters. Raven climbed down from the wagon and began unhitching the mare without being asked, his movements efficient and practiced. Faith watched him work, noting how he spoke softly to the horse in what sounded like his native language, how he checked the animal's hooves and legs with the thoroughness of someone who understood that a lame horse could mean death on the frontier. "You know horses," she observed. "My people have always been horse people," he replied, leading the mare into the barn. "Before the soldiers came, we had herds that stretched from horizon to horizon. Horses were wealth, freedom, power. Now," he gestured toward the single-tired mare, "now we are grateful for one old horse who still remembers how to work." Faith followed him into the barn, noting how he automatically checked the water trough and hay supply, how he arranged the harness with military precision. "Were you a warrior?" she asked. Raven paused in his work, his hands stilling on the leather straps. "I was many things. Hunter, horseman, scout for the army before the war turned us into enemies. I learned English from a missionary who lived with my people for 2 years. I learned to read from a trader who thought educated Indians would be better customers. And fighting. Were you a fighter?" "When I had to be." His voice was carefully neutral. "When soldiers came to drive my people from lands we had lived on for 1,000 generations, when they broke treaties faster than they made them, when they decided that the only good Indian was a dead Indian." Faith heard the bitterness underlying his calm tone and realized she was getting a glimpse into a history she'd never fully understood. The newspapers spoke of Indian wars as simple, stories of civilization versus savagery, but Raven's words suggested something far more complex and tragic. "The Morrison killings," she said carefully. "Could they be connected to the larger conflict? Someone trying to frame you to restart hostilities?" Raven finished with the harness and turned to face her fully. In the dim light of the barn, his features were cast in sharp relief, making him look both vulnerable and dangerous. "That thought has occurred to me," he admitted. "There are men in this territory who profit from conflict. Suppliers who sell weapons to the army, ranchers who want Indian lands opened for grazing, politicians who build careers on fear and hatred. A Modoc accused of murdering a white family would give them everything they need, but who would be clever enough to drug you and stage the scene so convincingly?" "Someone who knows both worlds," Raven said grimly. "Someone who understands how Indians think and how white men react. Someone with access to both communities." The implications of that statement hung between them as they walked toward the house. Faith had assumed that discovering Raven's innocence would be a matter of finding the real killer, but now she was beginning to understand that they might be dealing with something far more sophisticated and dangerous. The farmhouse felt different with Raven inside it, as if his presence had shifted the very dimensions of the familiar space. Faith lit the oil lamps while he stood near the door, clearly uncertain about his place in this domestic setting. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room, with a stone fireplace that Daniel had built with his own hands. "You can sit," Faith said, gesturing toward the rough wooden table. "This is your home now, whether either of us expected it or not." Raven moved carefully to the table, but remained standing, his eyes taking in every detail of the room. Faith followed his gaze, seeing her home through the eyes of a man raised in a completely different culture. The iron cookstove, the glass windows, the wooden furniture, everything must seem strange and artificial compared to the teepees and earth lodges of his people. "It's not much," she said, suddenly self-conscious, "about the humble surroundings. Daniel and I planned to build something larger when we had children, but—" She stopped, realizing she'd just mentioned children to a man she'd married hours ago for purely practical reasons. "It is warm and dry and safe," Raven said simply. "That is more than I have had for many months. I am grateful." Faith began preparing a simple meal from the supplies she kept on hand. Beans, salt pork, cornbread, coffee. As she worked, she became aware of Raven watching her movements with the same careful attention he'd given everything else. Not staring exactly, but cataloging information about this new environment he found himself in. "You're studying me," she said, echoing his earlier observation in the wagon. "I am trying to understand what kind of woman marries a stranger." "To save his life," Raven replied. "It is not something I have encountered before." Faith considered that as she stirred the beans, adding bits of salt pork and wild onions she'd gathered earlier in the week. "I'm not sure I understand it myself," she admitted. 6 months ago, if someone had told me I'd marry a Modoc warrior accused of murder, I'd have laughed at them. What changed? Faith paused in her stirring, considering the question seriously. What had changed? Daniel's death, certainly, and the financial pressures that followed. But something deeper had shifted as well, something in her understanding of herself and her place in the world. "I suppose I stopped believing that following the rules would keep me safe," she said finally. Daniel followed the rules. He worked hard, paid his debts, treated people fairly, went to church every Sunday, and it didn't save him when the mine shaft collapsed. It didn't save our dreams or our future or anything we'd built together. She turned to face Raven, who was listening with the focused intensity she was beginning to recognize as one of his defining characteristics. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. "So when I saw you in that cage, being treated like an animal for the entertainment of people who'd already decided you were guilty, I realized that the rules weren't about justice or fairness. They were about making people feel safe, while terrible things happened to anyone who didn't fit their idea of what was acceptable." Raven was quiet for a long moment, processing her words. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been understanding. "Among my people we have a saying, the wolf that runs with the pack is safe, but the wolf that runs alone sees the world as it truly is." "You have chosen to run alone, have I?" Faith looked around the small farmhouse, at the table set for two, at the man who was now legally her husband. "It doesn't feel like I'm alone anymore." "No," Raven agreed softly. "Perhaps we are both learning what it means to run with a pack of two." As if responding to some unspoken signal, they both turned their attention to the practical matters of the evening. Faith finished preparing the meal while Raven explored the house with her permission, familiarizing himself with the layout and the location of essential supplies. When she called him to eat, he moved to the table with the quiet grace she was beginning to associate with all his actions. The meal passed in comfortable silence, broken only by small practical conversations about the farm's routines and the approaching winter. Raven ate with obvious hunger, but also with careful manners, using his knife and fork properly, despite what Faith suspected was limited experience with such utensils. "You were educated by whites," she observed, as he cut his meat with precise economical movements. "Partially," he confirmed. "The missionary, Father Miguel, believed that understanding both cultures would help my people survive in the changing world. He taught me to read English and Spanish, to understand white man's law and customs." Was he right? Did it help? Raven's expression darkened. "It helped me understand exactly how much my people were losing and how little power we had to prevent it. Knowledge can be a curse when it shows you truths you cannot change." Faith felt the weight of those words, recognizing in them an echo of her own recent education in powerlessness. "But it also brought you here," she pointed out. "If you hadn't been able to speak English, if you hadn't understood territorial law, you'd probably be dead by now." "Thanks to you," Raven reminded her. "Knowledge without courage is useless. You provided the courage, As the evening deepened and the temperature dropped, Faith found herself facing a question she'd been avoiding all day. Sleeping arrangements. The farmhouse had only 2 rooms, the main living area and a small bedroom. That had been hers and Daniel's. The idea of sharing that space with Raven felt both impossible and inevitable. "There's a bed in the other room," she said finally, her cheeks warming despite the cool air. "And blankets. I can make up a place. Here by the fire if you'd prefer." Raven understood immediately what she was offering and what she was asking. "I will sleep by the fire," he said quietly. "This marriage may be legal, but it was not made for the usual reasons. I will not presume anything about your expectations." Faith felt a wave of relief mixed with something that might have been disappointment. "Thank you," she said. "I know this situation is strange for both of us." "Strange," Raven agreed, "but not unwelcome. I have been alone for a long time, Faith Dunbar. It is good to have someone to share a meal with, even under these circumstances." As Faith prepared for bed and Raven arranged blankets near the fireplace, she realized that something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of her situation. This morning, she'd been a woman facing impossible choices with no good options. Tonight, she was part of a partnership with a man who might be innocent of the crimes he was accused of. But more than that, she was no longer facing the future, alone. And for the first time since Daniel's death, that future seemed like something she might actually want to live to see. Faith woke before dawn to the sound of an axe biting into wood, each strike echoing across the valley with mechanical precision. She'd slept fitfully, her dreams filled with iron cages and burning homesteads, but the rhythmic chopping was oddly comforting, evidence that she wasn't alone anymore, that someone else was taking care of the endless tasks that kept a frontier. Farm running. She dressed quickly and stepped outside to find Raven splitting firewood behind the barn, his movements fluid and efficient despite wearing the same torn buckskins he'd had on in the cage. The pile of split logs was already impressive, enough to last several weeks, and she realized he must have been working since well before first light. "You didn't have to do that," she called out, wrapping her shawl tighter against the morning. "Chill." Raven paused mid-swing, the axe balanced perfectly in his hands. "Winter is coming," he said simply. "You will need fuel for warmth and cooking. I am here now, so the work is mine to do." Faith approached the woodpile, noting the clean, even splits that spoke of years of experience with an axe. "Where did you learn to work like this?" "From my father, who learned from his father." Raven set down the axe and began stacking the split wood with the same methodical care. "Among my people, a man who cannot provide fuel for his family's fire is not much of a man. We're not exactly a traditional family," Faith pointed out, though she was touched by his assumption of domestic responsibilities. "Are we not?" Raven straightened, studying her face with that intense focus she was beginning to recognize. "You are my wife under territorial law. This is our home. I am responsible for your welfare and safety. How is that different from any other marriage?" "Tishutin." Question caught Faith off guard because she didn't have a good answer. Their marriage might have begun as a legal stratagem, but the practical realities were forcing them into roles that felt surprisingly natural. "I suppose it isn't," she admitted. "Though most couples have more time to adjust to the idea, time is a luxury we do not have," Raven replied, resuming his stacking. "The circuit judge will arrive in perhaps 2 weeks. Until then, we must learn to live as husband and wife, or the pretense will not be convincing." Faith felt heat rise to her cheeks at the implication. "Pretense?" Raven paused in his work again, realizing he might have misspoken. "I did not mean to suggest deception, but Sheriff Hawkins will be watching us, as will others in the community. If they believe our marriage is merely a legal trick, to avoid trial, they may find ways to invalidate it." The truth of that statement was sobering. Faith had been so focused on the immediate crisis of saving Raven's life that she hadn't considered the longer-term challenges they would face. A marriage of convenience was one thing, but maintaining the appearance of a genuine partnership while living under community scrutiny was quite another. "Then we'd better learn quickly," she said, with more confidence than she felt. "Starting with breakfast. I'll cook if you'll milk the cow." As they settled into the morning routine of domestic tasks, Faith found herself studying Raven's interactions with the animals. He approached the cow with the same calm patience he seemed to bring to everything, speaking to her in soft Modoc words that somehow conveyed reassurance across the species barrier. The cow, who was usually skittish with strangers, stood quietly for him as if recognizing a kindred spirit. "You have a way with animals," Faith observed as they sat down to breakfast. "Animals do not lie," Raven replied. "They do not hate based on the color of skin or the shape of eyes. They judge based on intent and action. It makes them easier to understand than people." Faith poured coffee from the pot she kept warm on the stove, noting how Raven accepted the cup with both hands in what seemed to be a gesture of respect. "Is that why you've stayed silent so much? Because people are harder to understand?" "Partly." Raven sipped the coffee carefully, his expression suggesting he was still adjusting to the bitter taste. "But also because among my people words have power. We do not speak unless we have something important to say. Your people seem to use words to fill empty spaces, even when they have no meaning." Faith considered that observation as she ate her eggs and cornbread. How much of her conversation with neighbors and townspeople was indeed meaningless chatter, designed more to avoid uncomfortable silences than to communicate anything important? "What would you consider important enough to say?" she asked. Raven was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking about his answer. "Truth when it can help someone, warning when there is danger, gratitude when someone has shown kindness, love when it is felt deeply enough to be worth the risk of speaking it." The last item on his list hung in the air between them, creating a moment of unexpected intimacy that made Faith suddenly aware of how domestic their situation had become. They were sitting at her kitchen table like any married couple, discussing philosophy over breakfast while planning their day. A sharp knock at the door broke the spell, causing both of them to tense. Visitors this early usually meant trouble, and given their circumstances, trouble could take many forms. Faith opened the door to find Dr. Henley standing on her porch, his medical bag in one hand and a concerned expression on his weathered face. Behind him stood Elena Morrison, Danny's mother, looking nervous but determined. "Mrs. Raven," Dr. Henley said formally, "I hope we're not intruding, but Mrs. Morrison has some information she believes you and your husband should hear." Faith's heart began racing. Elena Morrison was the mother of one of the Modoc raid victims, and her presence could mean anything from new evidence to vigilante justice. "Please come in," she said, stepping aside to let them enter. Raven had risen from the table at the sound of voices, and he stood now with the careful stillness Faith was learning meant he was prepared for trouble. Elena Morrison took one look at him and stopped short, her face cycling through emotions Faith couldn't identify. "Mrs. Morrison," Raven said quietly, "I am sorry for the loss of your son. He was a good boy who deserved better than the death he received." Elena's composure cracked at the unexpected condolence. "You remember Danny?" "I remember all of them," Raven replied. "Jim taught me to use white man's tools. Mary shared her garden vegetables when our children were hungry. Danny asked me to teach him to track deer sign. They were good people who showed kindness to my family when others would not." Tears began streaming down Elena's face, but she wiped them away with an angry gesture. "That's why I had to come," she said, addressing Faith directly. "That's why." I couldn't let this go on without speaking up. Dr. Henley guided Elena to a chair, his medical training helping him recognize emotional distress, even when it wasn't physical. Mrs. Morrison has been struggling with some inconsistencies in the official account of the murders, he explained. What kind of inconsistencies? Faith asked, though she was afraid to hope for what the answer might mean. Elena took a shaky breath before speaking. The night it happened, Danny was supposed to be at home. We'd had words about him spending so much time at the Morrison place, and I told him to stay in and help with chores. But he snuck out anyway, said he wanted to see the new foal that had been born that afternoon. Faith exchanged glances with Raven, both of them sensing that this information was important even if they didn't yet understand why. Mrs. Morrison, Raven said gently, are you saying Danny was at the Morrison farm that night? He was there when the killing started, Eleanor said, her voice breaking. He saw what happened, he saw who did it, and it wasn't you. The silence that followed that statement was deafening. Faith felt her heart hammering against her ribs as the implications began to sink in. If Danny Morrison had witnessed the murders and seen the real killer, then everything the community believed about that night was wrong. Why hasn't this come out before now? Dr. Henley asked, his voice gentle but persistent. Why didn't Danny report what he saw? Elena's face crumpled. Because he's been in shock since that night. Hasn't spoken more than a few words to anyone. The doctor in the next county said it was grief and trauma, that he'd speak again when he was ready. But yesterday, when he heard about the marriage, he finally started talking. What did he tell you? Faith asked, barely daring to breathe. He said 3 men came to the Morrison place after dark. White men, not Indians. They were asking Jim about something, some kind of business arrangement that had gone wrong. Danny was hiding in the barn loft, watching through the hay door. Raven moved closer, his expression intense. Did Danny recognize any of these men? Elena nodded miserably. One of them was Deputy Walsh. Another was Tom Bradley, the blacksmith. The third was someone Danny didn't know, a man with a beard and a scar on his face. Faith felt the world tilt around her as the full meaning of Elena's words became clear. Deputy Walsh, the man who'd been so eager to see Raven hanged, had been at the Morrison place the night of the murders. Tom Bradley, who'd been charging money for people to torment Raven in his cage, had been there too. Mrs. Morrison, Dr. Henley said carefully, these are very serious accusations. Are you certain about what Danny told you? He drew pictures, Elena said, pulling a crumpled piece of paper from her coat. Danny's always been good at drawing. When he couldn't find words to tell me what happened, he drew this. She unfolded the paper to reveal a child's drawing, crude but unmistakably clear. 3 figures stood outside a small house, while another figure, clearly meant to represent Jim Morrison, lay motionless on the ground. Off to one side, a smaller figure crouched in what was obviously meant to be a barn loft, but it was the details in the drawing that made Faith's blood run cold. One of the standing figures wore what was clearly a deputy's badge. Another was depicted with the massive frame and leather apron of a blacksmith. The third had facial hair and what looked like a scar running down one cheek. Danny saw the whole thing, Elena continued, her voice barely above a whisper. He saw them kill Jim, then Mary when she tried to run. He saw them set the fire to cover their tracks, and he saw them take items from the house to make it look like a robbery. The saddlebags, Raven said suddenly. They planted Jim's saddlebags. On me, while I was unconscious, Dr. Henley was studying the drawing with the methodical attention he brought to medical diagnosis. Mrs. Morrison, would Danny be willing to testify to what he saw, before the circuit judge, I mean? Elena's face went pale. Testify against Deputy Walsh, against Tom Bradley. They'd kill him just like they killed the others. Not if we protect him, Faith said firmly, though she wasn't sure how such protection could be guaranteed. Not if we make sure the truth comes out before they can silence him. Raven moved to the window, scanning the horizon with the wariness of a man who'd learned that danger could appear without warning. Mrs. Morrison, how many people know that? Danny has started talking. Just me and Dr. Henley, Elena replied. And now you two. I came here as soon as Danny told me what he'd seen. Good, Raven said, though his expression remained grim. But it will not stay secret for long. News travels quickly in small communities, and if Deputy Walsh suspects that there's a witness to his crimes... He didn't finish the sentence, but everyone in the room understood what he meant. A deputy sheriff who'd committed murder to cover up some other crime wouldn't hesitate to kill a traumatized boy who could expose him. We need to get Danny somewhere safe, Faith said, her mind racing through possibilities. Somewhere Walsh can't reach him. And we need evidence beyond a child's testimony, Dr. Henley added. The drawing is compelling, but a good lawyer could argue that trauma affected Danny's memory or perception. Raven turned from the window, his expression thoughtful. There may be a way to get the evidence we need, but it will require taking considerable risks. What kind of risks? Faith asked, though she was already prepared to take almost any chance if it meant proving Raven's innocence. The kind that could get us all killed if we're wrong about who we can trust, Raven replied grimly. But if we do nothing, Danny Morrison will be in danger. I will hang for crimes I did not commit, and 3 murderers will go free to kill again. Faith looked around the room at the faces of the people who'd become her unlikely allies in this fight for justice. Elena Morrison risking her son's safety to tell the truth. Dr. Henley using his medical authority to challenge the community's assumptions. And Raven, who could have fled into the mountains but chose instead to stay and fight. For his vindication, "What do you need us to do?" she asked. Raven's smile was grim but determined. "We need to make Deputy Walsh believe that his secret is still safe while we gather proof of his guilt. And we need to do it before the circuit judge arrives and the case goes to trial." "How long do we have?" Dr. Henley asked. "Less than 2 weeks," Faith replied. "Maybe less, depending on weather and travel conditions." Elena Morrison stood up suddenly, her face set with the determination of a mother protecting her child. "Then we'd better get started," she said. "My boy has been carrying this secret for too long already. It's time for the truth to come out." As they began planning their investigation into the real Morrison killers, Faith realized that her impulsive decision to marry Raven had set in motion something much larger than she'd anticipated. They weren't just fighting to prove one man's innocence anymore. They were taking on a conspiracy that reached into the very heart of local law enforcement. But for the first time since Daniel's death, Faith felt like she was fighting for something that mattered, alongside people who were worth fighting for. And that, she thought, was worth any risk they might have to take. The plan they devised was dangerous, intricate, and depended entirely on Deputy Walsh's arrogance working against him. Faith spent 3 sleepless nights rehearsing her role, while Raven disappeared into the mountains each day, returning with information gathered from sources he wouldn't name. Dr. Henley had spirited Danny Morrison away to his sister's ranch 2 counties over, claiming the boy needed specialized medical treatment for his trauma. Elena remained in town, playing the part of a grieving mother who knew nothing more than what everyone else believed. "Walsh is getting nervous," Raven reported on the 4th evening, settling beside the fire after another day of careful surveillance. "He's been asking questions about Danny, about why Dr. Henley took him away so suddenly, and he's been spending time with Tom Bradley, having conversations that stop whenever anyone else approaches." Faith looked up from the letter she was writing. "Carefully crafted bait designed to draw their quarry into the open. Good. Nervous men make mistakes. And we need Walsh to make a big one if we're going to expose him before the circuit judge arrives." The letter was addressed to a fictional business associate in Sacramento, describing a lucrative mining claim that Jim Morrison had allegedly discovered before his death. According to Faith's carefully constructed lie, Morrison had confided the location to his wife Mary just before the attack, and Mary had whispered it to Faith during her final moments at the doctor's office. Faith claimed to be looking for a trustworthy partner to help her develop the claim, someone with local connections and the authority to handle any legal complications that might arise. "You think Walsh will take the bait?" Raven asked, reading over her shoulder as she put the finishing touches on the deception. "I think Walsh killed 3 people for something valuable, and when he didn't find it at the Morrison place, he assumed it died with them," Faith replied. "If he believes there's still a chance to get what he was after, his greed will overcome his caution." The next morning, Faith rode into town with the letter prominently displayed in her coat pocket, making sure to visit the post office when she knew Mrs. Patterson would be there. Mrs. Patterson was the town's most reliable source of gossip, and within hours, word would spread that the Morrison widow was corresponding with mining investors about some mysterious treasure. "Mrs. Raven," Mrs. Patterson said with barely concealed curiosity as Faith approached the postal window, "how are you adjusting to married life with that savage?" Faith had learned to ignore the casual cruelty in such comments, focusing instead on her larger purpose. "As well as can be expected," she replied coolly. "Marriage to any man requires adjustment, regardless of his background, I suppose." Mrs. Patterson sniffed, clearly hoping for more scandalous details. "Though I can't imagine what you see in him, a murderer and a heathen. An innocent man and my husband," Faith corrected firmly, pulling out the letter with deliberate obviousness. "I need to send this to Sacramento. It's rather urgent business." "Matter?" Mrs. Patterson's eyes fixed on the letter like a hawk spotting prey. "Business? What kind of business would you have in Sacramento?" Faith hesitated just long enough to seem reluctant before answering. "Mining business. Something Jim Morrison told me about before he died." The hook was set. Faith could practically see Mrs. Patterson's mind working, cataloging this new information for immediate distribution throughout the community. By evening, everyone in Millfield would know that Faith Dunbar, now Faith Raven, was corresponding with Sacramento investors about some secret mining claim connected to the murdered Morrison family. Faith completed her postal business and left town quickly, but not before making one more stop. She needed to visit Sheriff Hawkins, both to maintain appearances and to plant additional seeds that would eventually grow into Walsh's downfall. "Sheriff," she said, entering the office, where Hawkins sat behind his desk, methodically cleaning his rifle. "I wanted to thank you again for performing the marriage ceremony. I know it wasn't easy." Hawkins looked up from his weapon, his expression unreadable. "How are things working out at the farm? Your husband giving you any trouble?" "None at all," Faith replied truthfully. "He's been helpful with the chores and respectful of our arrangement. I think people will be surprised by how civilized he actually is." "Civilized enough to stand trial without causing problems?" "I believe so. Though I do hope the circuit judge arrives soon. This uncertainty is difficult for everyone involved." Hawkins nodded slowly. "Should be here within the week, barring bad weather. You prepared for what might happen if he's found guilty?" Faith had been dreading this question, but she'd prepared an answer that would serve her purposes. "I've been thinking about that," she said carefully. "If the worst happens, I'll probably have to leave Millfield. Start over somewhere else where people don't know about this whole situation." "Makes sense," Hawkins agreed. "Might be for the best anyway. This community has strong feelings about the Morrison killings." "I understand that," Faith said, "though I do wish there had been more investigation into what actually happened that night. It seems like everyone was so quick to assume guilt." Hawkins's expression sharpened slightly. "What do you mean by that?" Faith chose her words carefully, aware that Hawkins might be sympathetic to her cause, but could also inadvertently reveal her suspicions to Walsh. "I just think a more thorough investigation might have turned up additional evidence." Maybe evidence that would have pointed to other suspects. Other suspects? Mrs. Raven, your husband was found with stolen property and covered in blood. What other evidence do you think existed? I don't know, Faith admitted. But it seems strange that a man planning to commit murder would carry the stolen goods 3 miles from the scene and then just wander around waiting to be caught. Hawkins set down his rifle and studied Faith's face with the attention of a man who'd spent years reading people's motivations. You think your husband was framed? I think the whole situation deserves more investigation than it received, Faith replied diplomatically. But I suppose that's not for me to decide. As Faith left the sheriff's office, she felt reasonably confident that her performance had been convincing. She'd planted the seeds of doubt about the case while appearing to be nothing more than a loyal wife hoping for her husband's vindication. More importantly, she'd established herself as someone with valuable information about mining claims, information that would inevitably reach Deputy Walsh's ears. The next 2 days passed with agonizing slowness as Faith and Raven waited for their trap to spring. Raven continued his surveillance activities, noting the increasing frequency of conversations between Walsh and Bradley, while Faith made herself conspicuously visible around town, always carrying papers that could be construed as business documents. On the 3rd evening, their patience was rewarded. Faith was returning from feeding the chickens when she spotted a figure approaching through the twilight. Deputy Walsh, riding alone and making no effort to announce his presence. She hurried inside to alert Raven, who immediately took his position in the root cellar beneath the kitchen, where he could hear everything that transpired above. Walsh knocked on the door with the aggressive confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. Faith took a deep breath, steadied her nerves, and opened the door. "Deputy Walsh," she said with feigned surprise, "what brings you out here so late in the evening?" "Evening, Mrs. Raven," Walsh replied, his weasel face twisted into what he probably thought was a charming smile. "Hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I heard you might have some business opportunities you're considering." "Business opportunities?" Faith tilted her head as if confused, though her heart was racing with anticipation. "Mining opportunities," Walsh clarified, pushing past her into the house without invitation. "Word is, you've been corresponding with investors about some kind of claim?" Faith closed the door and turned to face Walsh, noting how his eyes darted around the room, taking inventory of her possessions and searching for signs of hidden wealth. "I'm not sure what you've heard, Deputy, but I don't think my private business affairs are really your concern." "Oh, but they are," Walsh said, his false friendliness evaporating. "You see, I've been doing some thinking about the Morrison killings, and I've come to realize there might have been more to that situation than anyone understood at the time." "What do you mean?" Faith asked, though she was beginning to understand exactly what Walsh was driving at. Walsh moved closer, and Faith caught the smell of whiskey on his breath. "I mean, maybe old Jim Morrison was sitting on something valuable. Maybe that's why. Your savage husband really went there that night, not to kill, but to steal. And maybe he found what he was looking for before the soldiers caught up with him." Faith forced herself to remain calm, despite the deputy's proximity and the menace in his voice. "Deputy Walsh, I think you've been drinking. Perhaps you should go home and sleep this off." "Don't play games with me, woman," Walsh snarled, his hand moving to rest on his pistol grip. "I know Morrison found something in those hills. I know he was planning to file a claim, and I know he told someone where. It was before he died." "Even if that were true," Faith said carefully, "what makes you think it has anything to do with me?" Walsh's smile was ugly and predatory. "Because Mary Morrison lived long enough to talk before the fever took her, and you were there in the doctor's office when she passed. Convenient, wouldn't you say?" Faith felt a chill as she realized how much thought Walsh had put into this. He'd been planning this confrontation since the moment he heard about her mining correspondence, possibly longer. Mary Morrison was delirious with fever, Faith said. Whatever she might have said in her final moments, she told you where the claim was, Walsh interrupted. And now you're trying to cash in on it with your Sacramento investors. Well, I've got news for you. That claim belongs to the people of this community. The people who lost friends and neighbors because of what Morrison found in those hills. The deputy's reasoning was twisted but internally consistent. He believed that Morrison's discovery had somehow led to the killings, and that Faith now possessed information that rightfully belonged to the community, or more specifically, to him. And if I did have such information, Faith said slowly, what exactly are you proposing? Walsh's eyes gleamed with avarice. Partnership. You provide the location, I provide the legal protection and local connections. We split the profits 50-50 and everyone wins. And if I refuse? Walsh's hand tightened on his pistol. Then I might have to reconsider the evidence in your husband's case. Might be that I overlooked some details that would guarantee his conviction. Might be that he resists arrest and gets shot while trying to escape. The threat was explicit enough to remove any doubt about Walsh's character or intentions. Faith realized she was dealing with a man who'd already committed murder and wouldn't hesitate to kill again to protect his secrets. You're threatening my husband, she said, allowing anger to creep into her voice. I'm offering you a business proposition, Walsh corrected. Your husband's continued health depends on your willingness to be reasonable about this mining situation. Faith moved toward the kitchen table, where she'd left several papers that looked like they could be mining documents. Walsh followed. Eagerly, his attention focused on the potential treasure rather than the very real danger lurking beneath the floorboards. The claim is located in the northern hills, Faith said, spreading out a hand-drawn map she'd prepared for this moment. About 15 miles from the Morrison place, near the old prospector's cabin. Walsh leaned over the map, his breathing heavy with excitement and whiskey. This is it? This is what Morrison found? According to what Mary told me before she died, Faith confirmed. Though I have to warn you, the area is dangerous. Unstable rock formations, potential for cave-ins. I'll worry about the dangers, Walsh said dismissively. What I need from you is a written statement about what Mary Morrison told you, something that will hold up in territorial court when it comes time to file the claim. Faith pretended to consider this demand while mentally calculating how much information she needed to extract from Walsh before springing their trap. Before I put anything in writing, she said, I need to know exactly what happened the night the Morrisons were killed. I need to know what my husband is really accused of. Walsh's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. What difference does that make? The facts are clear enough. Are they? Faith challenged, because something about this whole situation doesn't make sense to me. If Jim Morrison really found valuable mining claims, why was he still living in that modest farmhouse? Why didn't he file proper paperwork with the territorial office? Walsh was quiet for a moment, clearly debating how much to reveal. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of frustration that suggested this question had been bothering him for months. Because Morrison was a fool, he said finally. He thought he could develop the claim quietly, without drawing attention from claim jumpers or territorial officials. He was planning to extract enough gold to buy proper equipment before filing any paperwork. How do you know all this? Faith asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Walsh's face darkened with alcohol and remembered anger. Because I tried to reason with him. Tried to explain that he owed it to the community to share what he'd found. But he was stubborn, said the claim was his to develop as he saw fit. Faith felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. You went to see him that night, you and Tom Bradley. We went to make him a fair offer, Walsh said defensively. Partnership arrangement, just like I'm offering you. But Morrison got belligerent, started making threats about what would happen. If anyone tried to muscle in on his claim... So you killed him, Faith said quietly. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a gun barrel. Walsh's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, but Faith had positioned herself carefully, keeping the table between them. "Now hold on," Walsh said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Nobody said anything about killing. Things got out of hand, that's all. Morrison pulled a gun. We defended ourselves. And Mary Morrison, was she threatening you too when you shot her?" Walsh's facade of reasonableness crumbled completely. That woman should have minded her own business, should have stayed inside where she belonged, instead of trying to interfere. Faith felt a surge of anger at the casual dismissal of Mary Morrison's life, but she forced herself to remain focused on gathering information. "And the boy? Tommy?" "Morrison was just 12 years old. Kid wasn't supposed to be there," Walsh muttered. "Tom said the family would be at church, said we'd have time to search the place properly. But the kid came home early, started screaming when he saw his parents." The admission hung between them like a death sentence. Walsh had just confessed to murdering 3 people, including a child, and Faith was the only witness to his words. From beneath the floor came the soft sound of movement as Raven shifted position, preparing for action. Faith knew their conversation was nearing its end, that Walsh would soon realize how much he'd revealed and take steps to silence the only person who could testify against him. "You framed my husband," she said, backing slowly toward the door. "You planted Jim Morrison's belongings on him while he was unconscious." "Your husband was convenient," Walsh replied, drawing his pistol with practiced ease. "Half-breed savage found at the scene with stolen goods. Who was going to question that story?" Faith's hand found the door handle behind her, but Walsh was already moving to cut off her escape. "Too bad you had to be so greedy about this mining business," he said with mock regret. "Could have lived a nice, quiet life as a widow if you'd just minded your own business." The floorboards beneath Walsh's feet exploded upward as Raven burst. From the root cellar, like an avenging spirit, moving with the deadly grace Faith had heard described but never witnessed. Walsh spun toward the threat, but Raven was already inside his guard, one hand deflecting the deputy's gun arm, while the other struck with surgical precision at pressure points that dropped Walsh to his knees. The pistol discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as Walsh collapsed, his nervous system temporarily disrupted by Raven's precise strikes. Faith kicked the weapon away, while Raven secured the deputy with rope from the barn, working with the efficiency of someone accustomed to dealing with dangerous prisoners. "Did you hear enough?" Faith asked breathlessly. "More than enough," Raven confirmed. "He confessed to triple murder and conspiracy to frame an innocent man. That should be sufficient evidence for any reasonable judge." Walsh was beginning to recover his faculties, though his coordination remained impaired. "You can't prove anything," he slurred. "It's your word against mine, and who's going to believe a savage and a crazy woman?" "Actually," said a new voice from the doorway, "they're going to believe the territorial circuit judge who just happened to arrive early and witness this entire conversation." Faith spun around to see a distinguished gentleman in traveling clothes standing in her doorway, flanked by Sheriff Hawkins and Dr. Henley. The newcomer wore the unmistakable bearing of authority and carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to dispensing justice. "Judge Harrison," Sheriff Hawkins said formally, "allow me to present Mrs. Faith Raven and her husband, the defendant in the Morrison murder case." Judge Harrison stepped into the room, taking in the scene with the practiced eye of someone who dealt with frontier justice for decades. "Mr. and Mrs. Raven," he said courteously, "it appears you've solved a rather significant mystery for us." Walsh tried to protest his innocence, but his slurred words and the evidence of his own confession made his denials pathetic rather than convincing. Dr. Henley had brought young Danny Morrison back from his sister's ranch, and the boy's testimony, combined with Walsh's recorded confession, created an overwhelming case against the real killers. As Sheriff Hawkins placed Deputy Walsh under arrest and sent riders to apprehend Tom Bradley, Faith found herself standing beside Raven in the ruins of her kitchen, hardly able to believe that their desperate gamble had succeeded. "It's over," she said wonderingly. "It's actually over." Raven looked down at her with an expression she'd never seen before, not the careful neutrality or cautious hope of their earlier interactions, but something warmer and more personal. "The legal matter is resolved," he agreed, "but I think our story is just beginning." Judge Harrison approached them with a document in his hand. "Mr. Raven," he said formally, "in light of new evidence and the confession of the actual perpetrators, all charges against you are hereby dismissed. You're a free man." Faith felt tears pricking her eyes as the full weight of their victory settled over her. Raven was innocent, vindicated, free to rebuild his life without the shadow of false accusations. "And, Mrs. Raven," the judge continued, "your marriage remains legally valid regardless of the circumstances that prompted it. Whether you choose to continue as husband and wife or seek annulment is entirely up to you." Faith looked up at Raven, seeing her own emotions reflected in his dark eyes. They'd started as strangers, bound together by desperate circumstances. But somewhere along the way, they'd become partners in every sense of the word. "What do you think?" she asked softly. "Are you interested in making this arrangement permanent?" Raven's smile was the first completely unguarded expression she'd seen from him. "I think," he said, "that some marriages begin with love and hope, and for the future, others begin with necessity and grow into something deeper. Both kinds can be equally strong." "And which kind do you think ours might become?" Instead of answering with words, Raven reached out and took her hand, intertwining their fingers with the same careful precision he brought to everything else. "I think," he said quietly, "that we've already begun to find out." As the chaos of arrests and legal proceedings swirled around them, Faith realized that her impulsive decision to marry a stranger had led her not just to justice and vindication, but to something she'd never expected to find again, the possibility of a future worth living, shared with someone worth living it with. The frontier had taken Daniel from her, but it had also given her Raven. And perhaps, she thought, that was the kind of trade that defined life on the edge of civilization. Loss balanced by unexpected gain, sorrow tempered by surprising joy. Outside, the October wind was picking up, carrying the promise of winter and the challenges it would bring. But inside the farmhouse that was now truly their home, Faith and Raven faced those challenges together, no longer alone in a world that could be harsh and unforgiving, but partnered with someone who understood the value of promises kept and trust earned, and that Faith realized was worth any price she'd paid to find it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.